She paid nothing and demanded more, so I fired back with papers that could make her lose everything she takes for granted. 30 days, tick-tock.
When my daughter looked me straight in the eye and said she wouldn't help with the bills anymore, I smiled, nodded calmly, and said absolutely nothing. What she didn't know was that I'd already made a decision that would change both our lives forever. By the end of that week, she'd be packing her bags and learning exactly what financial independence really means. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown condo, casting long shadows across the marble countertops I'd worked overtime for 3 years to afford. Madison sat at the breakfast bar, her manicured fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Designer jeans, new MacBook Pro glowing beside her untouched Greek yogurt, AirPods dangling from her ears like expensive jewelry. At 24, she looked like success personified. The problem was, none of it belonged to her. "Dad, we need to talk." Her voice carried that familiar tone of practiced indifference, the same one she'd used since college when asking for money became as routine as breathing. I set down my newspaper and gave her my full attention, the way I'd done every morning for the past 6 months since she'd moved back home. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" She pulled out her phone, probably checking Instagram while delivering what she'd clearly rehearsed. "I've been thinking about our arrangement here, and I've decided I'm not going to contribute to household expenses anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. I blinked twice, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Madison finally looked up from her screen, her green eyes holding that familiar spark of entitlement I'd been enabling for far too long. "The bills, Dad. The utilities, the HOA fees, groceries, all of it. I need to focus on my career right now, and frankly, these expenses are holding me back from investing in myself." I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and supported and sacrificed for, who was now sitting in my kitchen telling me she wouldn't help pay for the roof over her head. The career she mentioned was a part-time social media consulting gig that brought in maybe $800 a month on a good month. The investing in herself involved daily shopping trips and weekend getaways with friends who still lived off their parents' money. "Madison," I said slowly, keeping my voice level, "you're living in a $3,000 a month condo in the heart of downtown. You eat the food I buy, use the electricity I pay for, enjoy the amenities I cover with my HOA fees. What exactly do you think would happen if I couldn't afford this place?" She shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who'd never worried about money because it had always been provided. "You'd figure it out. You always do. Besides, Dad, I didn't ask to be born. This is your responsibility as a parent. I shouldn't have to pay for basic necessities." The audacity was breathtaking. This was my daughter, the same little girl who used to help me count change for the laundromat when money was tight, who'd celebrated with me when I finally saved enough for our first real apartment. Now she sat in luxury I'd worked 60-hour weeks to provide, telling me that supporting her indefinitely was my obligation. Madison continued, apparently interpreting my silence as acceptance. "I've already calculated what I'll save each month. No more splitting utilities, no more contributing to groceries or household supplies. This will free up almost $1,500 that I can put toward building my personal brand and expanding my business network." $1,500. That was exactly what she'd been contributing to our monthly expenses, money that covered less than half the actual cost of maintaining our lifestyle. The mortgage alone was $4,200 a month, not counting utilities, parking, insurance, and the dozen other expenses that came with urban living. "You've really thought this through," I observed, watching her face for any sign of the daughter I'd raised, the one who used to have empathy and gratitude. "What's your timeline for this new arrangement?" "Starting immediately," she said, sliding her phone into her designer purse. "I've already adjusted my budget for October. Oh, and Dad, I'll probably need to borrow your car more often since I won't be splitting the insurance costs anymore. Mine is due for inspection, and honestly, the maintenance expenses don't make sense when I can just use yours." The morning sun had shifted, no longer casting shadows but flooding our kitchen with harsh, unforgiving light. I looked around at the space we'd called home for 3 years, at the custom cabinets and granite surfaces and stainless steel appliances, all of it paid for by my job as a senior project manager at an engineering firm, work that required 12-hour days and weekend calls and constant stress about deadlines and budgets. Madison had graduated college 2 years ago with a communications degree and $37,000 in student loans that I'd co signed and been making payments on ever since. She'd moved back home temporarily while looking for her dream job, which apparently meant scrolling through LinkedIn between spa appointments and brunch dates with friends whose parents had set them up with trust funds. The temporary arrangement had stretched from 3 months to 6 months to a year, and now into year two. Her dream job had evolved into a series of part-time gigs and freelance projects that barely covered her personal expenses, let alone contributed meaningfully to our household budget. How long do you think this new arrangement will last? I asked, genuinely curious about her long-term planning. Madison brightened, apparently pleased that I was engaging with her proposal rather than immediately rejecting it. Well, I'm really focusing on building my online presence right now. My Instagram following has grown by 12% this quarter, and I'm developing relationships with several potential brand partnerships. Once those start paying off, probably by next summer, I'll be in a much better position financially. Next summer, 8 months away, 8 months of me covering all our living expenses while she focused on becoming an influencer. I'd heard this timeline before, with different dates and different justifications. 6 months ago, it was going to be by Christmas. Before that, it was going to be by her birthday in March. Madison, I said carefully, do you know how much it costs to maintain this lifestyle we're living? She waved her hand dismissively. Dad, you worry too much about money. We're fine. You make good money. And this condo is an investment, right? It's not like you're just throwing money away on rent. The condo was indeed an investment, one I'd purchased specifically because I wanted to build equity instead of paying rent forever. But investments required consistent payments, and those payments required consistent income. And consistent income required working long hours at a job that was slowly grinding away my health and sanity. What if I lost my job tomorrow? I asked. What if the company downsized? Or I had a medical emergency that prevented me from working? Madison looked genuinely confused by the question, as if she'd never considered that our comfortable lifestyle might be vulnerable to circumstances beyond our control. That's not going to happen, Dad. You're being dramatic. Besides, you have savings, right? I did have savings, had being the operative term. 3 years of supporting 2 adults on one income while dealing with rising living costs and Madison's constant emergencies had depleted most of my retirement fund and eliminated my emergency reserves. The savings account that once held $40,000 now struggled to maintain a balance above $3,000. Madison finished her coffee and stood up, smoothing her designer jeans and checking her reflection in the chrome surface of our refrigerator. I'm meeting Sophia and Claire for lunch at that new place downtown. They're both launching their own businesses too, and we're going to brainstorm collaboration opportunities. Collaboration opportunities. Another way of saying they were going to spend 2 hours taking photos of their food for Instagram while complaining about their parents' expectations and planning their next shopping trip. I watched my daughter gather her things, the $1,000 purse, the designer sunglasses, the car keys to the vehicle I'd purchased and insured and maintained. Oh, Madison said, pausing at the kitchen doorway. Can you Venmo me $200? The lunch place is pretty expensive, and I want to make a good impression on the other influencers we're meeting. This could be really important for my career development. $200 for lunch. On the same day, she'd announced she wouldn't be contributing to our household expenses anymore because she needed to focus on her career. The irony was so perfect, it almost made me laugh. Of course, sweetheart, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the payment app. You know I want to support your dreams. Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. Thanks, Dad. You're the best. I'll probably be out pretty late tonight, too. Sophia knows this guy who works for a marketing agency, and he's throwing a networking event at some rooftop bar. Great opportunities to make connections. More opportunities, more expenses. More reasons why contributing to our shared living costs would interfere with her personal development. I watched her walk toward the front door, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors I'd had installed last year when she'd complained that the original carpet was embarrassing when her friends came over. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone in the silence of our expensive downtown condo. I sat back down at the breakfast bar and looked around at the life I'd built, the comfort I'd provided, the security I'd sacrificed my own future to maintain. My phone buzzed with a notification that the Venmo payment had gone through. $200 transferred instantly to fund another day of networking and collaboration opportunities while I prepared to work another 12-hour day to keep our lights on and our roof secure. I opened my laptop and stared at the spreadsheet I'd been avoiding for weeks. Monthly expenses, income projections, the brutal mathematics of maintaining an upper middle class lifestyle on a single salary, while supporting an adult child who considered financial contribution beneath her. The numbers told a story I'd been trying not to read. Without Madison's contribution, I'd be running a deficit of nearly $2,000 every month. My savings would be completely depleted within 6 weeks. The comfortable retirement I'd been working toward would become impossible. And the security I'd built over 25 years of careful planning would evaporate like morning fog. But Madison didn't know about the spreadsheet. She didn't know about the sleepless nights I'd been having, calculating and recalculating, trying to find a way to make the numbers work. She didn't know about the second mortgage I'd taken on the condo to cover her student loans. She didn't know that her father's generosity had limits, and those limits were approaching faster than either of us had anticipated. What she was about to learn was that independence was a two-way street, and if she wanted the freedom to spend her money on career development and networking lunches, she'd need to find somewhere else to live while doing it. I closed the laptop and walked to my home office, where I kept the important documents that governed our lives: lease agreements, insurance policies, financial records, and most importantly, the condo ownership papers that clearly showed only one name on the deed. The eviction notice forms I downloaded 3 weeks ago still sat in my printer tray, waiting for the right moment to be filled out and served. I'd hoped that moment would never come, that Madison would eventually recognize the unsustainability of our arrangement and volunteer to contribute more substantially to our shared expenses. Instead, she decided to contribute nothing at all. I picked up the first form and read the legal language that would transform our living arrangement from voluntary to involuntary termination. 30 days notice to vacate premises. Grounds for eviction. Non-payment of agreed-upon financial obligations. The words felt cold and clinical, nothing like the warm family conversations I'd imagined having with my daughter about responsibility and mutual respect. But warm conversations required two willing participants, and Madison had made her position crystal clear. She wanted all the benefits of our shared lifestyle with none of the obligations. She wanted security without sacrifice, comfort without contribution, independence without the inconvenience of actually being independent. I filled out the forms methodically, the same way I approached engineering projects at work. Name of tenant, Madison Elizabeth Parker. Property address, our downtown address that she'd bragged about to her friends for 2 years. Reason for eviction, violation of verbal lease agreement regarding financial contributions to household expenses. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was evicting my own daughter from a home I'd provided specifically to help her get on her feet. But helping someone stand up required them to eventually use their own legs, not lean forever on someone else's strength. My phone buzzed with a text message, Madison sending me a photo from her expensive lunch. Having the most amazing salmon. This place is perfect for content creation. Thanks again for making this possible, Dad. The photo showed a beautifully plated dish that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 days. In the background, I could see her friends, all of them perfectly styled, all of them living in the same bubble of extended adolescence that Madison had embraced as a lifestyle choice. I set the phone aside and continued filling out paperwork. Date of service would be tomorrow, Friday afternoon, when she returned from whatever networking event she'd planned for the evening. That would give her exactly 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements, just enough time to experience what actual independence felt like. The legal requirements were straightforward, but the emotional complexity was staggering. How do you explain to your child that love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior? How do you teach responsibility to someone who's never faced real consequences? How do you prepare them for a world that won't provide unlimited second chances? Madison had been insulated from reality for so long that she genuinely believed money appeared through some combination of wishful thinking and parental obligation. She'd never experienced the anxiety of wondering if she could make rent. She'd never had to choose between paying utilities or buying groceries. She never felt the weight of financial responsibility pressing down on her sleep and coloring every decision with careful calculation. But she was about to learn all of those lessons very quickly. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept important documents in a fireproof safe. Inside, alongside insurance policies and investment statements, was a folder labeled Madison's Education. Every tuition payment, every textbook receipt, every dorm fee and meal plan charge from 4 years of college. The total came to just over $87,000, not counting the student loans I'd co-signed and been paying on her behalf. $87,000 invested in her future, with the understanding that education was supposed to prepare her for self-sufficiency. Instead, she'd used her degree as a stepping stone to extended childhood, a justification for why she shouldn't have to contribute to the household that supported her lifestyle. The financial records painted a clear picture of 24 years of investment without return. Not financial return, I'd never expected that, but some basic acknowledgement that support came with responsibility. Some recognition that independence required actual independence, not just the freedom to spend money on personal desires while someone else covered life's necessities. I found the folder containing Madison's employment history, such as it was. 3 part-time positions since graduation, each lasting between 2 and 6 months. The social media consulting gig was her longest-running commitment, which said more about her previous jobs than her current success. Her income over the past 2 years averaged less than $1,500 per month, barely enough to cover her personal expenses, let alone contribute meaningfully to our shared living costs. But Madison had never presented her employment as insufficient. Instead, she'd framed it as strategic, a series of stepping stones toward her real career goals. Every job she'd left was because it didn't align with her vision. Every opportunity she'd declined was because it would interfere with her personal brand development. Every month of minimal income was just temporary, a sacrifice she was making to build something bigger. The something bigger never materialized, but the excuses kept evolving. My laptop chimed with an email notification, a message from my mortgage company about upcoming payment processing. $4,200 would be automatically debited from my checking account in 5 days, the same amount that disappeared every month to maintain our downtown lifestyle. Without Madison's contribution, that payment would reduce my available funds to less than $800, not enough to cover utilities and groceries for the rest of the month. The mathematics of our situation had become unsustainable, but Madison remained focused on her networking lunches and personal brand development. She'd calculated how much money she'd save by not contributing to household expenses, but she hadn't calculated how long I could afford to subsidize her lifestyle choices. The answer was 6 weeks, maybe 8 if I put everything on credit cards and hoped for the best. I pulled up my online banking and reviewed the past 6 months of transactions. Madison's Venmo requests had become increasingly frequent and increasingly expensive. Dinner with friends, new clothes for networking events, professional headshots for her social media profiles, weekend trips that were supposedly essential for her career development. Each request came with a detailed explanation of why the expense was an investment in her future success. The total over 6 months was just over $4,000, not counting her regular living expenses. $4,000 in discretionary spending while contributing $1,500 to our shared necessities. She was spending nearly 3 times more on herself than she was contributing to the household that made her lifestyle possible. But when I'd mentioned this imbalance during our conversation 6 months ago, Madison had been genuinely offended. She'd explained that investing in herself was exactly what successful people did. She'd pointed to examples of entrepreneurs who'd taken risks and spent money on image and networking before achieving breakthrough success. She'd made it sound like fiscal responsibility was actually a limitation on her potential. The logic was seductive, especially coming from someone you loved and wanted to see succeed. It was easy to rationalize one more month of support, one more networking opportunity, one more investment in her future. The problem was that the future kept moving further away, and the investments kept requiring more and more resources. I closed the banking app and returned to the eviction paperwork. The legal language felt harsh, but the financial reality was harsher. Supporting Madison's lifestyle choices was destroying my own financial stability, and her announcement that morning had made it clear she had no intention of changing course. Independence, I realized, couldn't be taught through conversations or encouraged through generosity. It had to be experienced directly, with real consequences and genuine stakes. Madison needed to learn what it felt like to be responsible for her own survival. Not because I didn't love her, but because love sometimes required difficult lessons. The eviction notice would force her to confront the reality she'd been avoiding. She'd need to find housing she could afford on her actual income, not her projected income or her hoped-for income. She'd need to budget for groceries and utilities and all the mundane expenses she'd taken for granted. She'd need to make decisions based on what she could actually afford, rather than what she wanted to experience. It would be the most valuable education I could provide, even though it would feel like punishment to both of us. My phone buzzed again. Another photo from Madison's networking lunch, this time a group shot of her with 3 other young women, all of them smiling and holding drinks that probably cost $20 each. The caption read, "Building my empire one connection at a time. Grateful for opportunities to invest in my future. Grateful for opportunities that I was funding while she announced she wouldn't contribute to our shared expenses anymore." The disconnect was so complete it almost seemed intentional, as if she'd convinced herself that my money and her money existed in completely separate universes with no connection between them. Tomorrow afternoon, she'd discover that those universes were about to collide in the most practical way possible. The evening stretched long and quiet after Madison left for her networking event. I sat in my home office, the eviction papers neatly stacked beside my keyboard, feeling the weight of a decision that would reshape both our lives. Through my window, I could see the city lights twinkling below, each one representing someone else's struggle to make ends meet in an economy that demanded more than it gave back. I opened Madison's social media profiles on my laptop, scrolling through 2 years of carefully curated content that told the story of a successful young entrepreneur living her best life. Designer coffee cups positioned artfully beside motivational quotes about manifesting abundance. Photos from expensive restaurants tagged with grateful hashtags about living authentically. Vacation snapshots from trips she'd funded with my credit card, captioned with inspirational messages about investing in experiences over material possessions. The comments section under each post painted a picture of admiration and envy. Friends praising her lifestyle choices, strangers asking for advice about building their own personal brands, followers inspired by her confidence and apparent success. None of them knew that every glamorous moment was subsidized by a father working overtime to maintain an illusion of independence. Madison's Instagram stories from that afternoon showed her networking lunch in real time. Boomerang videos of champagne glasses clinking together, close-up shots of business cards being exchanged, perfectly filtered selfies with captions about grateful for authentic connections and building meaningful relationships in the industry. Each story had dozens of views and responses, digital validation for a lifestyle built on borrowed money and deferred responsibility. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, where the breakfast dishes still sat in the sink. Madison's coffee mug bore traces of the expensive lipstick she wore to make good impressions at networking events. Her yogurt container sat abandoned on the counter, another small example of how she moved through life expecting someone else to clean up behind her. The refrigerator hummed expensively, filled with organic produce and specialty items that Madison insisted were essential for maintaining her energy levels and supporting her wellness journey. The grocery bills had doubled since she'd moved back home, not because we were eating more food, but because everything had to be premium quality to align with her personal brand values. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our text message history, a chronicle of 2 years' worth of requests disguised as conversations. "Can you grab some of those expensive protein bars when you're at the store?" "I'm meeting a potential client tomorrow and need to be at peak performance." Or, "Dad, I need to update my professional wardrobe. There's a networking conference next month, and first impressions are everything in my industry." Each request seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of dependency disguised as ambition. Madison had learned to present every personal expense as a business investment, every luxury as a necessity for her career development. She'd become fluent in the language of entrepreneurship without ever accepting the fundamental risk that made entrepreneurship meaningful. My phone rang at nearly midnight. Madison's name appeared on the screen, probably calling from whatever rooftop bar was hosting her networking event. I let it ring 3 times before answering, bracing myself for another request or explanation about why she'd be late coming home. "Dad," her voice carried over background music and crowd noise. "This networking event is absolutely incredible. I've made so many amazing connections tonight. There's this guy here who runs a digital marketing agency, and he's really interested in collaborating with me on some projects." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." I kept my voice neutral, not wanting to dampen her enthusiasm, even though I knew how these conversations typically ended. "The thing is," she continued, "they're all going to continue networking at this exclusive after-party downtown. It's exactly the kind of high-level event where real business relationships get formed. But there's a cover charge, and honestly, it's pretty steep." "How steep?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be more than I wanted to spend and less than Madison thought was reasonable for such an important opportunity. $300. But Dad, this could be the breakthrough moment I've been working toward. The agency owner specifically mentioned that he's looking for fresh talent to partner with on some major campaigns. This could literally change everything for my career. $300 for a cover charge to an after party where Madison would make connections that might possibly lead to opportunities that could potentially result in income at some undefined point in the future. It was the same logic that had guided every expensive networking event, every professional development conference, every investment in her personal brand over the past 2 years. Madison, I said carefully, you told me this morning that you needed to stop contributing to household expenses so you could focus on building your career. But now you're asking me to fund a $300 networking event. Do you see how those two things might seem contradictory? The music in the background seemed to get louder, or maybe Madison was moving closer to the speakers. Dad, this is completely different. This is a direct investment in my future earning potential. The household expenses are just recurring costs that don't generate any return. This could actually pay for itself within a month if I land one of these partnerships. She'd learned to speak fluent startup, turning every expense into an investment and every risk into an opportunity. But the mathematics remained stubbornly practical. $300 was $300, whether it was spent on utilities or networking events. The money came from the same account, and that account was approaching empty faster than Madison seemed to realize. I can hear how excited you are about this opportunity, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I think it's time you started making these investment decisions with your own money rather than mine. My own money? Madison's voice carried genuine confusion. Dad, I explained this morning, I need to redirect my cash flow toward building my business. I can't be spending money on basic living expenses when I'm trying to establish myself as an entrepreneur. The conversation was circular, the same logic loop that had governed our financial relationship for 2 years. Madison's money was too important to spend on necessities, so my money covered necessities while her money funded opportunities. But opportunities never seemed to generate enough income to change the fundamental equation. I'm going to pass on covering the after party, I said firmly. You'll need to decide if it's worth $300 of your own money to attend. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Madison spoke, her voice carrying a note of disappointment I'd heard many times before. Fine, Dad. I guess I'll just miss out on what could have been the most important networking opportunity of my career. I hope you're happy with that decision. The call ended before I could respond, leaving me alone in the quiet of our expensive condo, with the weight of being cast as the villain in my daughter's entrepreneurial journey. According to Madison's narrative, I was the obstacle preventing her success, the risk-averse parent who couldn't recognize the value of strategic investments in her future. But I was also the parent who'd been making those strategic investments for 2 years, without seeing any measurable return, beyond Madison's growing confidence that someone else would always fund her dreams. The time had come to introduce her to the concept of personal financial risk, even if it meant being temporarily cast as the antagonist in her story. I walked back to my home office and reviewed the eviction paperwork one more time. The legal language felt harsh in the context of a father-daughter relationship, but the financial reality was harsher still. Supporting Madison's lifestyle had already cost me my retirement savings and emergency fund. Continuing down this path would cost me the condo itself within 6 months. Madison's text messages started arriving 20 minutes later, a stream of passive-aggressive updates about the networking opportunities she was missing because of my lack of vision and support. Each message was accompanied by photos of other attendees who were clearly investing in their futures, while she sat outside, unable to afford the cover charge that could have changed everything. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated, refined through 2 years of practice. Madison had learned exactly which words would make me feel guilty about setting financial boundaries. She'd mastered the art of presenting her wants as needs and my budget constraints as personal failings. Every conversation about money became a conversation about whether I truly supported her dreams. But dreams without budgets were just expensive fantasies, and I'd been funding fantasies for long enough. Tomorrow afternoon, Madison would receive a formal introduction to the concept of financial accountability, delivered through legal paperwork that couldn't be negotiated or postponed through charm and persuasion. The eviction notice represented more than just a change of address. It was a graduation ceremony, marking Madison's transition from subsidized dreamer to independent adult. She'd resist the transition initially, but resistance was part of the learning process. Every successful entrepreneur had to master the skill of operating within financial constraints, and those constraints had to be real to be meaningful. I sealed the eviction papers in an envelope and set it on the kitchen counter where Madison would find it when she returned from her networking event. The placement was deliberate, positioned next to the coffee maker she used every morning, impossible to miss or ignore. The envelope contained 30 days' notice and a lesson that was 24 years overdue. Outside my window, the city continued its restless movement. Late night workers heading home from shifts that paid for modest apartments and careful budgets. None of them had the luxury of treating financial responsibility as optional or viewing independence as something that could be indefinitely postponed. They'd learned early that survival required contribution, that security came through earning rather than expecting. Madison was about to join their ranks, not as punishment, but as preparation for a world that wouldn't subsidize her lifestyle indefinitely. The networking events and personal brand development and strategic investments would continue, but they'd be funded by income she'd earned rather than support she'd assumed. The transition would be difficult, but difficulty was often the price of education. My phone buzzed with one final message from Madison. Just left the networking event early. Couldn't afford to stay for the real opportunities. Hope you're proud of holding back your daughter's success. We'll be home late. Don't wait up. I turned off the phone and walked through our expensive condo one last time, looking at the space Madison would need to leave in 30 days. The marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture that had seemed so important when we'd first moved in. All of it beautiful, all of it comfortable, and none of it sustainable without two people contributing to the expenses. Madison had chosen comfort over contribution, and now she learned what choices actually cost when someone else stopped absorbing the consequences. The lesson would be expensive and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary for her development into a functioning adult. I turned off the lights and headed to bed, leaving the eviction notice on the counter like a birthday present wrapped in legal paper. Tomorrow would bring tears and accusations and desperate attempts at negotiation, but it would also bring the beginning of Madison's real education and independence, the kind that couldn't be learned through networking events or personal brand development, the kind that required actual responsibility for actual consequences, funded by actual income earned through actual work. It was a harsh curriculum, but it was the only one that produced graduates capable of supporting themselves in a world that demanded more than good intentions and social media followers. Sleep came easier than it had in months, knowing that the most difficult conversation of my parenting career was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. But difficult conversations were often the most important ones, and this conversation was 24 years overdue. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made downtown living seem worth every expensive penny. I woke before my alarm, showered, and dressed with the methodical precision of someone preparing for a presentation that would determine the trajectory of two lives. The eviction notice sat exactly where I'd left it, white envelope stark against the black granite countertop, waiting to deliver a message that would shatter Madison's carefully constructed reality. I made coffee in the French press Madison had insisted we needed for proper caffeine extraction, another $60 necessity that had somehow become essential for her morning routine. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using her expensive equipment to prepare for the conversation that would end her access to such luxuries. Steam rose from my mug like smoke signals announcing the end of an era. Madison's bedroom door remained closed at 8:30, which meant she'd likely stumbled home sometime after 2 in the morning, probably posting Instagram stories about the networking opportunities she'd missed because of her father's lack of vision. Her sleep schedule had become increasingly erratic since moving back home, another symptom of a life without real structure or consequences. I settled into my home office and opened the spreadsheet that had been haunting my nights for weeks. The numbers told the same brutal story they'd been telling for months, but now they carried additional weight. Today, Madison would see these figures for the first time. She'd learn exactly what it cost to maintain the lifestyle she'd been taking for granted. Monthly mortgage payment, $4,200. HOA fees, $350. Utilities averaged $240. Parking for 2 vehicles, $180. Insurance for the condo, our cars, and life coverage, $420. Groceries for 2 adults with Madison's expensive taste, $600 minimum. Internet, streaming services, and the premium cable package Madison needed for her content research, $130. The total came to just over $6,000 in fixed expenses, before adding discretionary spending like dining out, entertainment, Madison's networking events, and the constant stream of personal investments she'd been requesting. My after-tax income from the engineering firm was $6,800 per month, leaving roughly $800 for savings, emergency expenses, and the financial breathing room that had evaporated over the past 2 years. Madison's contribution of $1,500 had been covering less than 25% of our actual living costs, but even that minimal participation had made the numbers work. Without it, the mathematics became impossible within 6 weeks. With her additional requests for networking funds and career investments, the timeline accelerated to complete financial collapse within a month. I printed out the spreadsheet and added it to the folder of documents Madison would need to review. Financial transparency had never been part of our arrangement because I'd wanted to protect her from the stress of adult responsibilities. But protection had become enablement, and enablement had become unsustainable for both of us. My phone buzzed with a text from my younger brother Marcus, who'd been watching this situation develop from his apartment across town. Morning coffee at the usual place? I could use some perspective on family dynamics before facing the day ahead. I grabbed my jacket and wallet, leaving the eviction notice exactly where Madison would find it when she emerged from her room. The morning air felt sharp and clean, a perfect contrast to the heavy conversation that awaited me later. Downtown Seattle moved with its familiar rhythm of ambition and caffeine, everyone rushing toward meetings and deadlines, and the kind of productive urgency Madison had never experienced. Marcus was already seated at our regular table when I arrived, nursing black coffee and reading news on his tablet. At 38, he'd built a successful accounting practice from nothing, working 80-hour weeks for the first 5 years until his client base stabilized. He understood the relationship between effort and reward in ways Madison had never been forced to learn. "You look like someone who's about to perform surgery on his own family," he observed as I sat down. "How bad is the financial situation?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the spreadsheet I'd been working on all week. Marcus studied the numbers with the trained eye of someone who'd spent his career translating financial data into practical reality. His expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the implications of Madison's announcement. "Jesus, David. She's been contributing less than 25% while consuming probably 40% of the resources. That's not sustainable even if you were making twice what you earn. And now she wants to contribute nothing while maintaining the same lifestyle? It gets worse," I said, scrolling to the section tracking her personal requests over the past 6 months. She's been asking for additional money almost weekly. Networking events, professional development courses, wardrobe updates, equipment for her social media work. The total is approaching $5,000 in discretionary spending while she complains about not being able to afford basic living expenses. Marcus leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with the expression of someone who'd seen this pattern before in his professional practice. "She's treating you like a business bank that provides unlimited funding without requiring a business plan. No accountability, no performance metrics, no timeline for return on investment, just continuous capital injection based on promises and potential." The business terminology was harsh, but accurate. Madison had learned to speak entrepreneur fluently without accepting any of the risks that made entrepreneurship meaningful. She'd positioned herself as a startup worthy of investment, while operating like a hobby funded by someone else's sacrifice. "What's your plan for today?" Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Eviction notice. 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements. She needs to learn what independence actually costs when someone else isn't subsidizing the education." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding both the necessity and the difficulty of the decision. "It's going to be brutal, but you're right. She's 24 years old and has never faced real financial consequences for her choices. Every safety net you've provided has just delayed the learning process." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching downtown Seattle wake up around us. Office workers grabbing coffee before meetings, construction crews heading to job sites, small business owners opening shops that required personal investment and daily risk. The entire city operated on the principle Madison had been avoiding, that security came through contribution, not expectation. "How do you think she'll react?" Marcus asked eventually. "Anger first, then disbelief, then attempts at negotiation." "She'll try to reframe this as me being unreasonable rather than accepting that her demands were unsustainable. But eventually, hopefully, she'll recognize that independence requires actual independence." My phone buzzed with a text message. "Madison, finally awake at 10:15 on a Friday morning. Morning, Dad. Can you grab some of those organic breakfast bars when you're out? Running low and have a video call with a potential client this afternoon. Need to be at peak energy." Even after announcing she wouldn't contribute to household expenses, she was still making requests for premium groceries funded by my budget. The disconnect was so complete it seemed almost intentional, as if she'd created separate mental categories for her money and my money that never intersected in her thinking. I showed the message to Marcus, who laughed with the kind of dark humor that comes from watching predictable behavior play out exactly as expected. She's requesting organic breakfast bars on the same day she's about to receive an eviction notice. The timing is almost poetic. I typed back a simple response. "We need to talk when I get home. Important family discussion." The reply came within seconds. "Can it wait until tomorrow? Super busy with client calls and content creation today. This weekend would be better for my schedule." Even conversations about our living arrangement needed to fit around Madison's content creation schedule. She'd learned to treat every aspect of life as subordinate to her personal brand development, including the practical matters that made her lifestyle possible. "No, this needs to happen today," I replied. "Be home by 4 p.m. The message showed as read, but no response came. Madison had probably gone back to preparing for her video call with the potential client who might possibly lead to income that could potentially change her financial situation at some undefined future date. Meanwhile, the eviction notice waited on our kitchen counter like a reality check wrapped in legal paper. Marcus and I finished our coffee and walked back toward downtown, where he'd spend the day helping small business owners navigate tax implications and financial planning. Real entrepreneurs with actual revenue and genuine risk, people who understood that success required more than social media presence and networking events. "I have to ask," he said as we reached the corner where our paths diverged. "Are you prepared for the possibility that she might choose to cut contact rather than accept responsibility? Some people would rather lose relationships than face the reality of their financial dependence." The question hit harder than I'd expected. I'd been so focused on the practical necessity of the eviction that I hadn't fully considered the emotional consequences. Madison might interpret this boundary setting as betrayal rather than education. She might choose to frame me as the villain who destroyed her dreams, rather than the parent who finally insisted she fund those dreams herself. "I'd rather have a daughter who resents me but supports herself than continue enabling behavior that's destroying both our financial futures," I said finally. "She'll always be my daughter, but she can't always be my financial dependent." We shook hands at the intersection, and I walked back toward our condo with the weight of the afternoon's conversation pressing against my chest like a physical burden. The eviction notice would force Madison to confront realities she'd been avoiding, but confrontation was just the beginning of a much longer learning process. Back home, I found Madison's bedroom door still closed, but could hear the sound of her voice through the walls. The video call with her potential client, conducted from bed at nearly 11 a.m. on a Friday morning. The professional image she projected online probably didn't include details about her actual work schedule or living arrangements. I used the quiet time to organize documents Madison would need to review. Bank statements showing exactly how much money had been flowing in her direction over the past 2 years. Receipts for the furniture in her room, the electronics she used for content creation, the professional wardrobe she'd assembled with my credit cards. A complete financial history of our arrangement, with totals that would shock someone who'd never bothered to calculate the actual cost of her lifestyle. The numbers told the story of a daughter who'd received nearly $47,000 in direct support over 24 months, not counting the housing, utilities, and daily expenses she'd been taking for granted. $47,000 that could have funded my retirement contributions, emergency savings, or the home improvements I'd been postponing to maintain her comfort level. Madison's video call ended around noon, followed by the sound of her shower running and the familiar routine of preparing for another day of networking and personal brand development. She emerged from her room at 12:30, dressed in the kind of carefully curated outfit that projected success while costing more than most people spent on clothing in 6 months. "Good afternoon, sweetheart," I said from the kitchen, where I'd positioned myself near the eviction notice. "How did your client call go?" "Really well, actually. She's interested in having me manage her social media presence for her consulting business. It could be a steady income stream if we can agree on terms." Madison moved toward the coffee maker, completely missing the white envelope positioned 3 inches from her usual morning routine. "That sounds promising. What kind of timeline are we looking at for this potential income?" She started preparing her elaborate coffee ritual, the kind that required specialized equipment and 15 minutes of careful attention to achieve the proper extraction and foam consistency. Probably a few weeks to finalize the contract, then maybe a month or 2 to see if we're a good fit for each other. But David, this could be exactly the breakthrough I've been working toward. Steady monthly income, plus the potential for referrals to other clients. A few weeks plus, a month or 2 meant at least 3 months before any money materialized. Assuming the potential client converted to an actual client and the working relationship survived long enough to generate meaningful income. Meanwhile, our rent was due in 5 days, and utilities would need to be paid by the end of the month. Madison, I said carefully, we need to discuss our conversation from yesterday morning about your decision not to contribute to household expenses anymore. She looked up from her coffee preparation with the expression of someone who'd hoped an uncomfortable topic would simply disappear if ignored long enough. Dad, I thought we covered that already. I need to redirect my cash flow toward building my business. This potential client I just talked to proves that my strategy is working. The strategy that had produced less than $800 in monthly income over 2 years, while consuming thousands in support and investment. But Madison presented each small opportunity as validation of her overall approach rather than evidence of its limitations. I picked up the white envelope and held it where she couldn't miss it. Madison, this is an eviction notice. You have 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements. The coffee mug slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble countertop with a sharp crack that sent hot liquid splashing across the surface. For several seconds, she stared at the envelope like it contained a language she couldn't translate. What are you talking about? Her voice came out higher than usual, carrying the first note of genuine panic I'd heard in months. An eviction notice? Dad, this is our home. You can't evict me from our home. This is my home, I corrected gently. You've been living here as my guest with the understanding that you'd contribute to household expenses. Yesterday, you announced that you no longer intend to honor that arrangement. This notice formalizes the end of our housing agreement. Madison grabbed the envelope with shaking hands, tearing it open and scanning the legal language with growing horror. 30 days notice to vacate premises. Violation of lease agreement. The formal terminology that reduced our family relationship to a landlord-tenant dispute governed by state law. This is insane, she said, her voice rising to match her panic. You can't treat your own daughter like some random tenant who didn't pay rent. I live here, Dad. This is my address, my home, my life. And maintaining this home costs $6,000 every month in fixed expenses. Your contribution of $1,500 covered 25% of the actual costs, and now you've decided that even that minimal participation is too much of a burden on your career development. I pulled out the financial spreadsheet and placed it on the counter next to the eviction notice. Madison stared at the numbers like they were written in hieroglyphics, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing comprehension of how unsustainable our arrangement had become. $6,000, she whispered. I had no idea it cost that much to live here. The admission revealed the depth of her disconnect from financial reality. For 2 years, Madison had been consuming resources without understanding their cost, making decisions based on what she wanted rather than what we could afford. The mortgage, utilities, insurance, and daily expenses had been invisible to her because someone else had been handling the mathematics. Madison sank into one of the bar stools, still holding the eviction notice like evidence of a crime she couldn't believe had been committed. Dad, you're talking about making me homeless? Your own daughter. Homeless because I want to focus on building my career instead of paying your bills. The reframing was immediate and predictable. In Madison's version of events, she was the victim of an unreasonable father who expected her to pay his bills rather than a grown woman who'd been living beyond her means at someone else's expense. The household expenses we shared had become my personal financial obligations that she was being unfairly asked to subsidize. Madison, I said, keeping my voice calm despite the emotional manipulation, you're 24 years old. You have a college degree and 2 years of work experience. Finding housing you can afford on your actual income isn't homelessness. It's independence, something most people your age achieved years ago. Most people my age don't have the entrepreneurial vision to build something meaningful, she shot back. They're content with mediocre jobs and boring lives. I'm trying to create something bigger, something that will generate real wealth, not just pay for basic survival. The entrepreneurial vision that had generated less than $20,000 in income over 24 months while consuming nearly $50,000 in support and investment. But Madison presented her minimal earnings as proof of concept rather than evidence of unsustainability. How exactly do you plan to create wealth without understanding basic financial management? I asked. You've been spending more money than you earned for 2 years while someone else covered the difference. That's not entrepreneurship, that's subsidized hobby pursuit. The words hit their target. Madison's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, the combination that appeared whenever her financial dependence was addressed directly rather than diplomatically. She'd learned to present her lifestyle as strategic choice rather than acknowledge the support that made it possible. So what? You want me to get some soul-crushing corporate job that pays just enough to afford a depressing studio apartment? You want me to give up on my dreams and settle for mediocrity like everyone else? I want you to learn the relationship between income and expenses that governs every other adult's life, I replied. Your dreams are expensive, Madison. If you want to pursue them, you need to find a way to fund them yourself, rather than expecting someone else to subsidize your lifestyle indefinitely. Madison stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city she'd been enjoying at my expense for 2 years. The view that had seemed so important when we'd first toured the condo, the urban sophistication that provided the backdrop for her social media content and networking events. This is unbelievable, she muttered. My own father, giving me an eviction notice like I'm some deadbeat who's been taking advantage of his generosity. After everything I've contributed to this household, all the ways I've helped make this place feel like a home. The contributions she mentioned were decorative rather than financial. Madison had excellent taste in interior design and had helped choose furniture and artwork that made our space more beautiful. But beauty didn't pay mortgage payments or utility bills, and aesthetic contributions couldn't substitute for financial responsibility. What exactly have you contributed, Madison? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Help me understand what you think justifies living here without paying for the privilege. She turned from the window with the expression of someone who couldn't believe the question was being asked. I've contributed my presence, my energy, my creativity. I've helped you not be lonely after Mom died. I've brought life and youth and excitement to this place. Those things have value, Dad, even if you can't put a dollar amount on them. The mention of her mother hit like a physical blow, and Madison knew it. She'd learned to weaponize grief when practical arguments failed, turning my loss into justification for her financial dependence, as if supporting her lifestyle was somehow honoring her mother's memory rather than preventing my own financial recovery. Your mother would want you to be independent and self-sufficient, I said quietly. She'd want you to build something meaningful with your life, not spend your 20s being subsidized by your father while calling it entrepreneurship. Mom would want her family to stick together and support each other through difficult times, Madison countered. She wouldn't want you throwing your only daughter out on the street because of money problems that aren't even my fault. The conversation was deteriorating into emotional manipulation and historical revisionism, exactly what I'd expected but hoped to avoid. Madison was rewriting our financial arrangement as family mutual support, rather than acknowledging the one-sided nature of the resource flow. In her version, we were both struggling together rather than one person carrying the full burden, while the other pursued expensive dreams. Madison, I love you more than anything in this world, but love doesn't pay rent. It doesn't cover utilities or groceries or the 100 other expenses that make this lifestyle possible. You announced yesterday that you wouldn't contribute to those expenses anymore because they interfere with your career goals. This eviction notice is simply the logical consequence of that decision. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating whether tears might be more effective than anger in changing the outcome. Madison had learned to cycle through emotional responses until she found one that generated the desired result. But this time, the mathematics were too stark for manipulation to overcome. How am I supposed to find an apartment in 30 days? She asked, her voice shifting to the kind of practical panic that suggested she was finally beginning to understand the reality of her situation. Do you know how expensive rent is in this city? Even a studio apartment costs at least $1,500, and that's before utilities and parking and all the other expenses. Exactly, I said, grateful that she was finally engaging with practical considerations rather than emotional appeals. That's why most people your age have roommates or live in neighborhoods where rent consumes 30% of their income, instead of expecting someone else to subsidize their housing costs. But I can't have roommates, Madison protested. My content creation requires quiet space and good lighting. I can't be professional when there are other people around making noise and interrupting my workflow. The professional requirements that had never generated professional income levels. Madison had created elaborate justifications for why she needed expensive accommodations while producing minimal revenue, as if the right environment would automatically generate the success that had been eluding her for 2 years. Then you'll need to find a way to earn enough income to afford private housing, I said. Or you'll need to adjust your professional requirements to match your actual financial capacity. Those are the choices independent adults make every day. Madison walked back to the counter where the eviction notice lay next to her abandoned coffee, now cold and mixed with the liquid she'd spilled in her shock. She picked up the legal document again, reading through it more carefully this time, perhaps hoping to find some loophole or technicality that would invalidate its requirements. 30 days, she said quietly. You're giving me 30 days to completely restructure my life because you've decided that supporting your daughter is too much of a financial burden. I'm giving you 30 days to begin living within your means instead of beyond mine, I corrected. This isn't punishment, Madison. It's education. You need to learn what independence actually costs when someone else isn't absorbing the difference between your lifestyle and your income. The apartment fell silent except for the hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of city traffic far below our windows. Madison stood holding the eviction notice like a diploma from a university she'd never wanted to attend, finally understanding that her graduation from subsidized living was no longer optional. "What if I can't find anywhere affordable to live?" she asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "What if I end up having to move back in with roommates or find some terrible place in a bad neighborhood? Then you'll learn to live within your actual financial means instead of the imaginary budget you've been operating under for the past 2 years," I said. "And maybe that experience will motivate you to build a business that generates real income instead of treating entrepreneurship as an expensive hobby funded by someone else's sacrifice." Madison folded the eviction notice and slipped it into her purse with the defeated gesture of someone who'd finally realized that manipulation wouldn't change mathematics. The conversation was ending not because we'd reached agreement, but because she'd run out of arguments that could overcome the brutal simplicity of our financial reality. "I need to make some phone calls," she said, moving toward her bedroom with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. "Start figuring out what I'm going to do with my life now that my own father has decided I'm not worth supporting anymore." The parting shot was designed to leave me feeling guilty about setting boundaries, but guilt had been replaced by relief. For 2 years, I'd been enabling Madison's avoidance of adult responsibility while watching my own financial security evaporate. The eviction notice represented the beginning of her real education and independence, even if she couldn't recognize it as a gift wrapped in legal paper. I cleaned up the spilled coffee and put away the financial documents, leaving Madison to begin the process of calculating what independence would actually cost. The apartment felt different already, lighter somehow, as if the weight of unsustainable expectations had begun to lift from walls that had been straining under the pressure of subsidized dreams. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "How did it go?" I typed back, "Better than expected." She's beginning to understand the mathematics of the situation. Next 30 days will be educational for both of us. The response came immediately. "Proud of you for finally setting boundaries. This was 24 years overdue." Outside our floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle continued its relentless movement toward evening. Millions of people managing their own relationships between income and expenses, without expecting someone else to absorb the difference. Tomorrow, Madison would join their ranks, not as punishment, but as preparation for a world that rewarded contribution rather than potential. The lesson would be expensive and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary for her development into a functioning adult. Independence couldn't be taught through conversation or encouraged through generosity. It had to be experienced directly, with real consequences and genuine stakes. Madison's real education was finally about to begin.